More deadly explosions in Iraq as the country slides into a deeper sectarian and political crisis. The violence comes just weeks after the US troop withdrawal. So, is Iraq descending back into deadly chaos? And can the politicians agree on any kind of reconciliation before it's too late? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Darren Jordan. 4 explosions ripped through the Iraqi capital on Friday. Earlier, 2 Shia pilgrims were killed in Baghdad by roadside bombs. The wave of violence comes after a series of explosions killed at least 84 people on Thursday. A suicide attack hit Shia pilgrims heading to the holy city of Karbala, killing nearly 50, the deadliest in Iraq in more than a year. Well, these latest strikes have now raised fears of a deepening sectarian divide in a country sliding into political chaos. Well, Iraq's political discord has been blamed by some for the latest spate of violence. But what challenges does Nouri al-Maliki's government face? Well, the first is security. Thursday's attack was the second large-scale bombing since US troops pulled out last month. When Maliki issued an arrest warrant against the country's Vice President Tareq alHashemi, Iraq plunged into political chaos. Hashemi now faces terror charges. He fled to Iraq's Kurdish region. He said December's deadly attacks could only be the work of the Iraqi government. And as political instability takes over, Shia cleric Muqtada al-Sadr called for a referendum on his own plan to prevent renewed sectarian violence, and he appears to have support. So, is Iraq sliding further into sectarian violence? Well, joining us to discuss the issue, we're joined by our guests from Baghdad, Saad Almutalabi. He's a former advisor to the Iraqi government. He's also the Secretary-General for the Iraqi Free Youth Movement. From London, Gala Riani, a senior Middle East analyst for the business advisory firm IHS Global Insight. Also from London, Fanar Haddad, a visiting lecturer at Queen Mary University of London and the author of the book Sectarianism in Iraq, Antagonistic Visions of Unity. A warm welcome to you all. Gala Riani in London, let me start with you, if I may. Who do you think is behind this latest round of violence, and how worried are you by the sectarian dimension of the violence we've seen, certainly over the last few days anyway?
Well, thank you very much, firstly, for having me on the show. It's a real pleasure. It's really hard to say exactly who's behind the attacks, of course, until there is a group that takes responsibility, and this is usually the way it goes in Iraq. Obviously, there have been various allegations going around, and I think those are very symptomatic of the very sensitive political situation that we see today. What I can say is that certainly the attacks bear the hallmark of al-Qaeda in Iraq, who have carried out these types of attacks very much in the past, very much of the same nature, so on and so forth. The fact that it was a very sectarian target also would indicate that it could be them, and really they are the ones who would seek to benefit really from the current political stalemate. And I would say that at this point there is quite a lot of concern about where Iraq is heading. The most recent political crisis has heightened these sectarian tensions, and there's a lot of fear, I think, on the ground, obviously, but also from the outside, the international community looking on, there's a lot of concern about where Iraq is heading.
Let's put that question then to Saad Almutalabi in the Iraqi capital. Saad Almutalabi, who do you think is behind the violence, and who has most to gain from these sorts of attacks?
Really, nobody is to gain from the political parties, because when the explosions happened at the beginning, there were finger pointing at partners within the government. But when the details came out and there was a suicide bomber, then the fingers turned to al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda in Iraq is still active. Iraq is still in the circle of danger from al-Qaeda. So it's very difficult to say that somebody will benefit out of this. It's very dangerous to play on this particular sectarian note and on this type of violence. Definitely the Sunnis are had nothing to do with this. The Shias, of course, are the victims. And so naturally this points directly at al-Qaeda, and as a movement for al-Qaeda, they would usually try to harvest any kind of political unrest in Iraq to deepen the divide between the people in Iraq. But I don't see a direct link between the political problems Iraq is facing now and these attacks on pilgrims.
Well, let's put that then to Fanar Haddad in London. Fanar Haddad, Saad Almutalabi says there's no direct link there at all. But I mean, who do you think is behind the violence? Some say it's sectarian, some say it's al-Qaeda. What's your assessment of who is actually doing this?
Well, I very much agree with the previous speakers in that, I'm not entirely sure, and I think it's too early for anyone to be entirely sure, that the recent bout of violence is actually linked to the political crisis. I mean, is this a manifestation of the, or a result of the American withdrawal? Is it a result of the political stalemate? Is it sectarianism? We can't be sure just yet. And I think a more profound problem at the moment is the political crisis, the stalemate. Now, is that a sectarian issue? Again, it's not a clear-cut case. Sectarianism is certainly relevant to the current political crisis, but is sectarian identity and sectarian competition, is that the driver of this political crisis, or is it the dysfunctional nature of the Iraqi state, of the new so-called new Iraq, that is allowing, that is, I beg your pardon, leading to political stalemate and thereby opening up space for whoever is behind these most recent attacks?
Well, let's explore. Okay, well, let's explore the political dimension to this, which is what you've just opened up, and go back to Gala Riani in London. Gala Riani, the timing of this, of course, is significant. US troops have just pulled out. There's growing political crisis in the country. There's a spat between the Iraqi Prime Minister Noor al-Maliki and the Vice President Tareq alHashemi. Al-Hashemi says the government is behind much of this. So how is the politics likely to play into all of this stuff we're seeing on the ground right now, the killings, the bombings, etc.?
Well, the first thing to say is really I disagree. I agree with much of what was said, but I disagree that the political crisis has not affected the security situation. I definitely think that it has, in the sense that you will have, especially on the Sunni side, militants who will seek to capitalize on this very precarious situation on the political front. The fact that there are groups within Iraq who can interpret the political crisis as a sectarian one is indicative of the very immature political system, the fact that political rules are not well established, the fact that none of these parties trust each other, the fact that we've had a coalition government for over a year that's had a great deal of difficulty operating, and these political difficulties feed straight into the security system. The militants who were able to stage these horrific attacks over the past couple of days have managed really to discredit the government to some degree, and for them that is a victory. They've also managed to make the security forces seem, although in the absence of US forces, that they cannot keep these attacks from happening. So really, there's a really circular situation here where everything feeds into each other, and I think the important point really is that the political uncertainty gives militants the opportunity to once again enter the political scene and cause even more chaos.
I want to expand, if I can, that issue of Tareq al-Hashemi with Saad Almutalabi. Saad Almutalabi, how much is this arrest warrant that was issued against the Iraqi Vice President inflaming, certainly, as some seem to suggest, the sectarian violence, but also the political uncertainty in Iraq? I mean, I interviewed Tareq al-Hashemi a few days ago. He says he's innocent of the terror charges. He says it's the government that's stoking much of the violence. He said the arrest warrant against him is politically motivated. So why is he being pursued in this way, do you think?
Naturally, he would say that, but we all agree that he's innocent until proven guilty. So there's no question about his status at present. But I would definitely disagree that this political unrest is leading militants. I must here clear out this point that most 90%, 95% of ex-Sunni militants have joined the reconciliation process, and we do not have any further militants after the Americans left. The only real movement that is working in Iraq is Al-Qaeda, the only group that is continuing their atrocities, and they have released a communique for not this attack but the one previous to that, and they claimed responsibility for those attacks. The political unrest is creating some type of divide within the street, but it will not lead to any a real sectarian violence as we witnessed in 2005 and 6 and 7 because of the absence of the ingredients of a sectarian war. There are no militias from both sides. The government position is far more stronger than it was in the past. There aren't any Americans that people can hide behind them. All these matters have changed the picture in Iraq now. Now, Tareq alHashemi would definitely declare his innocence. It's very natural of him to defend himself, and we are waiting for him to come to Baghdad and face the court and face justice, and hopefully can prove his innocence. Okay,
Fanar Haddad, let me get a final point from you on this issue of Vice President alHashemi. He's a Sunni, of course. Many people see this move by Nouri al-Maliki as perhaps sectarian and political. Is this likely to undermine this very fragile power-sharing government in Iraq anyway, because of this ongoing spat between the two major players?
Well, that's very likely. I wouldn't say inevitable, but very likely. Now, whether this is a sectarian issue or not, the problem I think, with so-called sectarianism, the problem is that it's a perceptual issue. So regardless of what the realities are, it's the perception that this is a sectarian move that has inflamed public opinion. It may well have been the case that Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki was just engaging in some aggressive political maneuvers against political rivals. But the perception is nourished that this is a sectarian issue. Now, again, this sort of points to, I mean, we're kind of focusing on the symptoms and ignoring the illness. The illness being that this is a profoundly dysfunctional state. So take the recent row about federalism, which preceded the Hashemi issue by very shortly. Why is it that this turned into a sectarian issue? After all, the Sunni majority governorates that were calling for federal status, not all Sunni governorates actually called for federal status, and those that did so as individual governorates rather than unity, sort of a Sunni state. Now, the point I'm getting at is it turned into a sectarian issue because of the selective application of the Constitution. So as long as you've got a dysfunctional coalition government that is paralyzed, major policy has still to be taken on hydrocarbons. There's an issue of divisions of power. There's an issue of centralization of power, particularly security portfolios, and so forth. This dysfunctional government allows sectarian identity, sectarian competition, which could just remain a social issue, turns into a political issue.
Okay,
and that is the problem in Iraq, that the politicization of a sectarian divide of a social issue, whereby your political interests come to be tied to your sectarian identity.
Okay, and that's an interesting point you make. I want to put that issue of those political maneuverings to Gala Riani in London. I mean, one of those political maneuverings we saw is Nouri al-Maliki, surprisingly perhaps, trying to lobby Sadrist groups like Asaib al-Haq. I mean, this is a group alleged to be financed and trained by Iran. It has no record of peace that we know of. Many Iraqi politicians, even the speaker, says this is a dangerous move by Nouri al-Maliki. Why is he doing this, do you think?
I think that's an incredibly important point, and the issues that were raised about perception are very important. And the thing to perhaps stress is that this government has done very little to help itself. A lot of the actions that it's taken have made it very easy for others to label as being sectarian and as being sectarian motivated. For example, the issue of federalism was brought up. Actually, it was the government that came out and said these demands for federalism have been issued for sectarian reasons, and therefore we won't accept them. On the other hand, as you mentioned, there's a hand being reached out essentially to some of these Shia militias, and that raises again the possibility for groups within Iraq to allege that the government is building a very strong Shia-dominated government to balance out the Kurds to some degree, but also the Sunnis, and that in turn raises allegations which have been all over the international community that it's an issue with regards to Iran, that Iran is lobbying the government to pursue a kind of sectarian policy, and that bringing in some of these militias would be part of that strategy. And I think the key thing really is the fact that the government is not helping itself. It's not proving to Iraqis that it is not a sectarian government. A lot of the actions that it's taken have really opened it up for criticism. And at the same time, it has failed to improve the issues that would really help Iraqis, which is basic services, so on and so forth. Corruption continues to go on. And I think from the Iraqi street, you don't see as much effort being put into those issues as the energy that's put into these political debates. But I think the question of federalism is central to the future of Iraq.
Okay.
That fact that you have not only the Kurds who are pushing for greater independence essentially in many of their moves, but also these Sunni regions who are demanding autonomy, but you have a government that's continuously centralizing, and that is a clash that's obviously coming to a head.
Yeah, Saad Almutalabi, you were advisor to Nouri al-Maliki, you know him well. Of course, Gala Riani makes this very interesting point that much of what the government is doing seems to have some sort of sectarian dimension to it, and perhaps even overriding any sort of political goodwill out of it. So why is Nouri al-Maliki, for example, courting Sayyid al-Haq? I mean, does he feel hostage to Muqtada al-Sadr, who's always threatening to withdraw from the bloc anyway?
No, actually, Saad al-Haq are enemies to His Eminence Muqtada al-Sadr. Maliki is not courting them. What's happened that all the militias and all troops, fighting forces were invited to put down their guns and to join the reconciliation issue. And the 20th Revolution Brigade, the Islamic Army, Omar Army, Muhammad Army, these are Sunni groups, Jaish al-Mujahideen, and many, many others joined the reconciliation process, and they're all Sunnis. And from the Shiite side, Saad al-Haq also joined the reconciliation. So that is an open invitation to all groups that were fighting the Americans, that since the Americans have left now, there's no need for guns anymore, put them down and join the political process. So that is an issue that is open for all sectarians. Now, I must point out one issue here. There is indications that to the failure of the coalition or the power-sharing government, or in other words, the consensual democracy that we are trying to imitate, and the consensual kind of government here is basically not based on solid foundation. All political parties within the parliament are mirrored within the government. We don't have an opposition, a proper opposition in the parliament, so we have the opposition inside the government. And naturally, that is a very dangerous way to rule the country.
Fanar Haddad, let's just move away from the political dramas for a second. I want to ask you, I mean, this latest violence which we've seen, scores of people blown up and killed, this violence underscores that Iraq still has major security problems, major security challenges. What's your assessment now of those security challenges for the al-Maliki government, fragile though this coalition government is?
Well, it's quite a struggle that the Nouri al-Maliki government, or any government at the moment in Iraq, would have to deal with. The security portfolio is a thick one, and it's promising to get even thicker. The absence of the Americans, of course, does not help issues. There's several issues that have their roots right back in 2003, or during the constitutional writing of the constitution in 2004, 2005, that are only now coming to a head. I mean, I would hesitate to give a prediction of how things are going to unfold on the so-called trigger line with the Kurdish regional government. That's just one potential problem in the near future. Today, Saad al-Haq, I saw, were threatening that Iraq is on the verge of Shia war, intra-sectarian war. And I found that interesting because I think it underlines that the security dimension should not be so starkly linked to sectarian dynamics. It's not simply Shias versus Sunnis. I think the violence is much more complex. There's external forces at play here as well. And also, I shudder to think how Syria is going to impact on future developments in Iraq, including sectarian relations.
Okay, Gala Riani in London, you touched earlier on the issue of Iran. Of course, many international and local players are worried about Iran's increasing influence in Iraq. How much worry is there that Iran will now try and increase its influence in the country, particularly amongst Shias, of course, and widen the sectarian divide and take advantage of the political instability happening now?
Well, I'm not necessarily sure it's a question about Iran increasing its influence. Its influence in Iraq is already incredibly high, and that goes not only for the Shia parties, but due to the relations with the Kurds and the border issues and the fact that there are many Kurds in Iran as well, it has the ability to put a great deal of pressure on the Kurdish regional government as well. It is a question of how it will choose to use that influence. Iran doesn't necessarily benefit from severe sectarian divides within the Iraqi system. It benefits from retaining its influence, both political as well as economic, and it benefits from making sure that decisions made at the center in Baghdad benefit itself. So it's almost the case of Yemen, for example, the Yemeni situation for Saudi Arabia, or the Lebanese situation for Syria and other neighboring states. Iran benefits from having a somewhat chaotic situation that it can maneuver, but not a state that's completely collapsed, that would cause itself difficulties. So it will benefit from having an incredibly strong position within Iraq, where it can pull the strings that it needs to pull to get its way.
Saad Almutalabi, let's not forget that many Iraqis view Nouri al-Maliki as perhaps Iran's stooge in Iraq. I mean, how is Iran likely to retain that influence that Gala Riani is talking about?
Well, Maliki proved that he is politically independent. And even the Americans agree that he works for Iraq and not for Iran. And actually, we have many problems with Iran. And Iran still remain a neighboring country, a very large neighboring country, but we are holding on the fort here. And you can be assured that he is not a stooge, or any such description could fit to Mr. Nouri al-Maliki. The problem is that the Americans left, the Arabs have left Iraq alone, and it's very natural for other people to try to get to gain influence within Iraq. The Americans left the border completely open for 4 or 5 years, and that opening of the borders naturally will allow and invite other neighboring countries to interfere in Iraq. Now the picture is quite different.
Let me just get a final thought from Fanar Haddad, because Saad Almutalabi touched on the issue of the Americans there. What's your assessment now, Fanar Haddad, of any role that the US can play in Iraq? I mean, clearly the Americans don't want to see Iraq descend into chaos after pulling their troops out, but what role can Washington play here?
Well, it can play a very strong role. I mean, there's still a lot of soft power at work here. And we shouldn't forget that the Americans for some time have been very much out of the picture in terms of direct military action on the ground in Iraq. The fear prior to their withdrawal, and which unfortunately seems to be bearing out now, is that the American presence offered a psychological barrier for Iraqi political actors to hold them in check, so to keep a balance. And the fear was always that when that psychological barrier is removed, will Iraqi actors, political actors, seek to enforce their will on their competitors, which seems to be what happened with Nouri al-Maliki and this
let me get a final quick thought from Gala Riani before we go. Is there any political resolution out of this, Gala Riani?
Well, there could be. I mean, we've had crises in Iraq before. They've dragged out for a long period of time, and eventually there's been some degree of resolution. It's not impossible, but I'd like to point to the previous comments of the fundamental dysfunction within the system, the lack of mature political rules that everybody abides by, and the fact that these non-existent rules even can be so wildly flouted, and that's the real danger.
All right, we have to leave it there. Gala Riani in London, Saad Almutalabi in Baghdad, and Fanar Haddad, also in London. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. We want you to send us your feedback, so just email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching from the whole team here. Goodbye for now.